Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to just wait one more minute and then we will get started. Okay, let's get going. Hello, thank you so much for joining ProArc's Power Generation Roundtable, IT's role in improving reliability and profitability. Before we get started, I'm going to quickly cover a few items. We are recording this session, so you will receive the slide deck and recording later this afternoon. And please ask questions using the Q&A function throughout the presentation. There will be open Q&A time with our panelists at the end of the discussion. And today's roundtable is being moderated by Michael Montagliano, ProArc's Chief of Innovation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael. Michael, take it away.
Thank you, Rebecca. Good morning and welcome, everyone. As Rebecca said, I'm Michael Montagliano, Chief of Innovation at ProArc. I'm going to be your moderator with this wonderful panel we have today. So just to begin, let me set the table a little bit. While many power generators have begun their digitalization journey, several challenges constrain effective implementation. Market disruptions, complexity, emerging technologies, regulatory changes, cyber events, and new supply demand dynamics of power generators, focusing on driving operational excellence to improve their plants' availability, flexibility, and efficiency. Today's roundtable will discuss technology's role in improving reliability and profitability in the power generation industries. So before we get started, let's meet our panelists. On the far left, we have Mike Spoon, who is our power team lead and president of ProArc. On the far right, Ben Wilcox, Chief Technology Officer of Security and Cloud. And in the middle, we have Luke Bixby, Senior Technology Consultant, who has many years' experience at actually implementing solutions in the energy segment. I'm going to start off by just asking each of you to give us some brief overview of your roles and experience in power generation.
Thanks, Michael. So again, I'm Mike Spoon, president of ProArc. I've been doing work with our customers, our power generation clients for many, many years now. And we've been able to help our clients understand, many of the things that they've been asking for, which is, increased flexibility over the things that they need to do to be as profitable as they can. And today we're going to talk a lot more about that. But suffice it to say that I'm excited to be part of this panel and looking forward to our conversation.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Ben Wilcox, ProArc CTO of Security and Cloud. I've been working in the energy sector for about 15 years. Originally starting off supporting our customers from the technical aspect, and have since been supporting our customers from their migration to cloud services, leveraging digitalization and the path that we can help assist them, using their data, using their platforms to the best, and using it as an operational advantage. So that's my role today.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm Luke Bixby. I'm a senior technology consultant here at ProArc in the cloud and infrastructure team. I've really been here 7 years, contributing to how we support and provide IT solutions for power generation. I also have an IT background in manufacturing and automation, which actually share a lot of the similar components to generation plants. So things like PLCs and all of that hardware that you see in those systems. Here I'm primarily focused on delivering technology reviews and gap analysis for both the business as well as the control networks and systems. I also provide those IT solutions to fit the business needs and provide some guidance on meeting NERC compliance.
Thanks, gentlemen. Let's get to the first question. Over time, the technologies that underpin critical infrastructure have become more digitalized and connected, either to enterprise IT systems or to each other. The traditional boundaries that were in the past are becoming more transparent. So first question for Mike. What are the steps toward aligning information technology and operational technology, IT and OT?
Well, thanks, Michael. That's a great question. OT, which is really the industrial side of IoT, has been with us for decades. Energy, manufacturing, other industries are heavy users of OT technology. It's critical to running a business leveraging IT. OT is critical in running production. So today, if you think about it, they're two sides of the same coin, because of the critical nature of aggregating data from generation/production, depending on if you're energy or a manufacturer, and analyzing and securing data to optimize running the business and getting the best financial return on investment as possible. Working with a company that has experience across both sides of the company, OT and IT, can then bring significant rewards to the organization.
I think you bring up a really valid point there, Mike, with having someone be experienced, right? How do you leverage that data between the IT, OT side to make a advantage for your business, right? We all want to make better decisions, and a lot of that stuff just kind of sits within the data itself, right? In the past, we've had, if we think about the OT side, right, this is a very asset type intensive platform, right? It's used, and probably the information was specifically with that piece of equipment, right? We need to move that out of there so it's not just siloed anymore. OT, if we think about it, is a lot of standalone systems, like older IT type stuff, sometimes things that haven't been or modernized, but there are methods for getting that information out. And and then aligning those with digital use cases. So some of those digital use cases could be like maintenance planning, right? What's the best time to do this maintenance? When should I be doing this maintenance? When will it not impact my costs quite as much? Asset performance management and asset investment planning, right? So you start understanding how your assets are being used. There's a concept that's kind of evolved with cloud called digital twins, and digital twins allows you to have like an operational type environment that is fictitious and operating within the same specifications as your on-premise, but it allows you to do some modeling and understanding when things can potentially start failing. So in those types of instances, right, you can start pulling some of your data out of these OT sites and start using them to make business decisions. And so with some of those things comes a lot of a business advantage, and having a partner that can help guide you and understand ways that you can transform it are really going to be key.
Luke, any thoughts?
Yeah, as a technology consultant, really, I've been to lots of different sites, and I look at it as that point of delineation between, what NERC calls that ESP and your business networks. And there's been maybe some misconception that everything's isolated, there is no connectivity, and that's not always the case. And some of it's part of what you already know. You get your historical data and things like that, so that point is there. But you may have a vendor or even a managed service provider that it is not aware of compliance, or really security is not their number one concern, and they're deploying something into that environment that is opening you up to vulnerabilities potentially, as well as NERC violations. So I've actually seen some of those at different sites where the local people deploy something. So it's definitely important to be aware of that. But also, on what Ben was saying is, like, how do you get information out of that that OT controls environment? How do you do it safely and securely? Operational data, emissions monitoring, combustion dynamics. These are all data points which might be very useful to the business side as well as your partners. So supplying that in a secure process, as well as maybe even deploying some modern authentication methods like multi-factor authentication to secure it even tighter is very important.
Thanks, Luke. Rebecca, let's move to the next slide. So question number 2. Energy, resiliency, and sustainability have become priorities for power generation companies, with new threats like climate change, cyber attacks, supply chain disruptions. Looking back at the ice storm in Texas last year that took down much of the energy grid, events like that could have severe consequences and threaten lives. So for question number 2, what strategies and technology can be utilized to improve resiliency? Ben, let's start with you.
Thanks, Michael. This is a really important one, right? It gets to the core thing that operational plants need to consider is how to become as resilient as possible. So the first thing is realizing that there's a need there, right? And so let's act right now. There's no time like the present to start improving the resiliency. What that comes down to is, first thing you need to do is consider that it's not just the physical aspects that you need to plan for, but also the digital aspects, and accounting for those both equally, because there's needs on both, right? The plant needs the physical resiliency, but also the digital aspects that operate those today and that are key for business need to be planned up on. So plan on then teaming up and collaborating in the organization, right? You want to understand where your risks and your gaps are. And then start prioritizing critical infrastructure assets and taking action on those. That's kind of like the first process that would be done to help understand where you should be applying resiliency. Secondly, after those things have been kind of done, comes other methods for ensuring that the resiliency is actually operational. So that includes system acceptance testing, failover testing, going through a process of annual testing for business continuity and disaster recovery processes. Those things need to be aligned so that you're kind of prepared and ready should something happen, right? How do you respond? You want a plan that's operational at that point, right? And when it comes to security, there's ways that we can test those things too, right? We want to be able to test those security functions, right? You should be leveraging pen testing, which means a functional way for a security company to come in and test those security controls. Are they able to gain access to your internal network externally? Are they then, from the internal network, able to move into your OT network, or understand, are there aspects of those, those critical assets that are part of the NERC side that need to be monitored and tested against? So those things can be done on a regular basis, meaning like an annual or biannual. But there's also newer technologies out there that can kind of test those things on a more consistent, frequent basis. They call them like a breach attack simulation. So that's kind of where things are going forward for things, but it certainly doesn't replace pen testing.
Yeah, I'd like to just add that there's the groups that are doing these kind of cyber attacks. They're aware of everything, and they get in there and they start searching your environment, and they're trying to figure out what you're using on your network, and your backups are that critical link to be able to restore. So from a potential attack, so sandboxing them away from production, separating credentials, which don't, that's one of the things that we see is that, they're on very similar, they're using same credentials as your production environment, your backup system is using the same passwords and the same networks, that those are really easy attack points for a cyber attack. They're going to find that, and then your backups are gone as well. So keeping those separate, testing your backups at least monthly, applying those best practices like encryption, having multiple copies of your backups, including one off-site, where the cloud really fits for storage in that sense, especially being generation plants are typically one location, so extending that storage into the cloud, and having that disaster recovery ability, as Ben pointed out, is very critical.
Mike, before we move to you, just a quick follow-up question to that. So I know we've moved a number of energy workloads into the cloud. Does architecting cloud native type of deployments bring some type of resiliency, additional resiliency by being in the cloud?
Yes, absolutely. And I would say that the resiliency can work hand in hand with those systems that are still in your data center. So things like authentication, your authentication services are great to have that married to the cloud, as well as your like I mentioned, the storage. There's quite a bit of cloud analytics and things like that you can utilize that would really strengthen that resiliency.
Mike, how does this benefit power generators?
Yeah, you've been hearing up to this point some really great technical insights from both Ben and from Luke. I'm going to look at it a little bit from the business side. And as we've seen over time, there have been many cyber attacks in the energy industry. Michael, you mentioned, the not so much the attack, but the challenge in Texas. Everyone certainly knows about the infamous gas pipeline ransomware attack. They have significant impact, and not just on those businesses that are being attacked, but on consumers as well. And so, today we all need to be aware, particularly those who are generating power today, need to be aware of the negative publicity that something like this can generate. No pun intended. For the owners of the plant, for the plant itself, amongst the broader community. And so, all of this together, these negative consequences, really, seems to suggest that there should be a strong encouragement for companies to plan for the worst, but invest for the best outcomes. And whether that's in cyber insurance, whether that's in infrastructure, whether that's going to cloud, all of those things are critical to developing that level of resiliency to maintain the integrity of the operation. So if you think about it, in power generation, we're all governed by NERC compliance controls. I would suggest that you need to go beyond just NERC compliance controls because of the basic nature, the foundational nature of those controls, and go beyond. For example, there's NIST 1823. There are other best practices. There's new regulation coming down the pike from NERC and through FERC, for example. So, think about resiliency as part of the business objective, as something versus something that is simply something that you have to do, because it's really all about ensuring that your business is going to be, and the plant is going to be operating at its most optimum level and generating the kind of revenue that ownership is looking for.
Very good.
I'd like to add something to that. I was just thinking that from the NERC side and the compliance, right? that is really designed around reliability, right? And it's the energy grid side of things. What it's not designed to do is protect your business. It's designed to create resiliency around the energy side of it, right? That operational aspect. So, you know, if you're only meeting NERC requirements, then you're kind of ignoring the business aspect. And that's a really kind of key area that, you know, you need to be making sure that you have security controls that are business ready as well on the security front.
Thanks, Ben. That's great. Rebecca, next question. So mergers and acquisitions are frequent in the power generation industry. I saw a statistic from the Institute of Mergers, Acquisitions, and Alliances that showed more than 3,200 recent transactions. Transitions can be challenging as plant managers scramble to retrofit operations into new company models. So the question is, how can a plant utilize the cloud and IT standardization to ensure streamlined IT transitions in the future? Mike, let's throw it back to you again.
Great, thanks, Michael. So, you know, that's, again, it's something that all, you know, plant owners and certainly the investors themselves, you know, need to consider, you know, when they look at transitions in the future. You know, the owners of generating assets usually have spent a lot of time analyzing the plant that they want to acquire, or we'll say even divest. But in the case of an acquisition, you know, what the goals are for that plant, or maybe it's a group of plants. Maybe there's an acquisition, you know, that involves multiple plants, and you know, of course, their interest, whenever this planning is being undertaken, is often to have maximum flexibility relative to the future of that plant in terms of length of ownership, and certainly the evolution of the financials for that plant or plants. One of the things that cloud brings is, and you've heard a little bit of it already in our discussion today, is flexibility. The fact that cloud services are sort of enabling organizations, investors, and plants to take advantage of cloud, which is sort of ubiquitous, right? In terms of accessibility, as well as you've heard, you know, managing resiliency. This really gives additional flexibility to the owners, so that as their goals start out at one level, but perhaps evolve over time, in terms of, you know, how they see the duration of the ownership of a plant or plants, then that flexibility enables them to improve their own flexibility. And in fact, when you go through an actual transition plan, as you move from one owner to another owner, that transition point is made much easier by the fact that services may be in the cloud, right? Because it's a much easier prospect to point in one direction and then into another direction versus what do I do with all this, you know, on-site infrastructure, and who owns it, and who owns the data, and so forth. And so by leveraging cloud, you get a much more seamless transaction in terms of IT infrastructure and the data that resides along it.
Luke, Ben, I think you have.
Yeah, I just to add to really what Mike is pointing out, is that the cloud is a benefit, especially to like a greenfield plant or an acquisition. I'm taking that engineering side of this. Is, you know, you have typically a plant that is being built, or you're bringing on new employees, but you may have that, you know, the chicken before the egg type of deal, where you want to start collaborating, you want to start sharing information between those groups, but there's that admin building or that data center is not built yet. So we've actually done that as an organization where we've set them up in the cloud with all of that authentication that I was talking about earlier. And those resources get people connected from their trailers, the temporary trailers, or even a remote location while that acquisition is happening, while that building is being built. And then once that physical data center is ready, that transfer is really seamless and almost non-impactive to those employees. So the cloud is helped us already in the past to accomplish that for clients, and I see it becoming even more important in the future.
Yeah, a couple of things to add there. From our experiences, cloud makes divestiture infinitely more easy, especially in networks that are interconnected with other facilities or dealing with that separation side of things. It's beneficial today with the supply chain issues that we're seeing within the hardware side of things to be able to leverage the cloud as much as possible. Generally, there's not constraints with being able to provision cloud services where what we're seeing today from a lead time perspective on physical hardware is sometimes greater than 15 months at this point. So the ability to move at business pace, the cloud accelerates that. And can really kind of keep up with it, versus some of the legacy on-prem is really kind of challenging in that aspect. Also repeatability. Cloud allows for some standardizations, and once you've kind of have a configuration that works for the organization that's been defined, it can be templatized and turned into a repeated configuration that's rapidly deployed. So in many ways, we're able to accelerate not only just by using new services, but by reusing the way that it's been working. So those are two ways that I see.
Just to kind of add a little bit to what we're all talking about here today, and you mentioned divestiture, Ben, and that is most oftentimes when an investment firm acquires a plant or plants, there's a legal grouping, right? There's an individual legal entity that is typically created or transferred. And so one of the things that is also enabled is a much cleaner divestiture in the case of selling a plant by virtue of the fact that cloud is being leveraged. That legal separation is made much cleaner because there's, again, none of the sort of the physical handicaps that come along with assets on premise. And so just another consideration, not so much in terms of the tasks that have to be undertaken, but really more about the way in which owners have to consider what are the costs of divestiture in terms of making that happen, as well as the legal ramifications of that divestiture. So
That's a great point, Mike.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we'll move to the next question. Rebecca? We touched on this a little bit earlier, regulatory compliance and NERC, which is an effort to set minimum standards for cybersecurity practices. It's the floor of what organizations should do in terms of cyber protection. Power generators, however, are caught in a difficult situation. The increasing cost of complying with environmental, labor, and other regulations creates additional operational complexities, straining operating margins. At the same time, failure to comply can result in substantial fines or the closing of plants. So Luke, let's start with you. I know you have a lot of experience in NERC. How can power generators address the challenges of maintaining NERC compliance?
Yeah, that's good question, Michael. Organizations, They do. They need to constantly keep up with the evolving compliance and regulations, and like you said, that's the base. And it really is, as Ben mentioned earlier, about the bulk energy and the grid and disruption of that. So there's ways of doing that. You can utilize like a compliance managed services, have smaller organizations may be able to engage like a virtualized CISO that can look at those security bulletins that everyone gets from these governing bodies and be able to interpret them, but also having a partner that knows not just your business side, but your control side, that OT side. Some of these security bulletins can be pretty vague, or just pointing out a certain piece of hardware that may be in an environment, and in having an understanding of that and auditing your assets on both your business and control side is very important. And then creating those partnerships with experienced organizations that can kind of walk you through that NERC compliance and help you satisfy the different requirements that are evolving, and there's new requirements that are coming up as well.
Ben, do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, so looking at the self-attestation side of things, right? There's many of those areas are very IT centric, and having a partner that can help you kind of navigate those and understand what the NERC compliance is and answer some of those technical questions, as Luke kind of pointed out, is really important. So that partner should help you be able to identify what the gaps are, and then helping you kind of get your organization in line with the standardization. That same partner, the benefit of having one that kind of knows the two sides of it is that the goal is to lead to quicker outcomes, right? We all know that there's 50 ways to do things, for IT, and if there's one way to, you're looking for one outcome, there's 50 ways to get there. You want the quickest way that gets there, that has the least amount of resistance, that leads the business to meeting that obligation as quick as possible. Those partners should have a go-to solution. If they don't, then they haven't been doing it long enough. Standardization around how to get there should be part of that discussion, and should help you streamline it, right? You don't need to be having to go out and find your own solution, compare what's the best, etc. It's really kind of critical that they have those things ready to go. Secondly, Luke kind of alluded to this too, is right, we know new legislation is going to be coming for critical infrastructure. Right? It's part of the plan that there. NERC has been, will constantly be updating as well. There's some things that are critical from a relationship perspective with having a partner too, right? What services can you use in the cloud? Which ones can you not? And if they can't answer those types of questions, then they're probably not the right partner for you. So for example, the way that NERC is written today, there is no accountability for some of the more new technologies, and so it's dated in a fashion that only considers physical segmentation of things. There is no logical separation of controls, which are how cloud services operate. So that means, for example, that if you have a BES critical asset, it is not actually cloud ready, and is not something that should be able to be operated within that. But if it's not a BES critical asset, cloud should be a possible option for you in those instances.
I just like to add something to what's been said here. A lot of what we're talking about today, simply because of the nature of the reason for doing this webinar, this panel, is around IT and OT, right? But NERC, I just want to point out, does have some non-IT ramifications and responsibilities, imposed on the part of ownership. So I don't want anyone to think that, we're sitting here today and saying all of your NERC needs are going to be answered by IT. On the flip side, I would say ensure that you've got someone that you partner with whether it's an IT organization or some other organization, that walks you through, or even internally, that walks you through all of the requirements that NERC requires, whether you be a low impact or medium impact or high impact or whatever, even no impact plan, so that all of the bases are being covered. Many of them are IT related, but not all.
That's a good point. And with the blending of IT and OT, there's other regulatory that probably starts to come into play. So you want to understand the crosswalks between NERC and any other regulatory obligations you have as well. So
exactly. In fact, I mentioned earlier NIST 1823 is not an obligation, but it's certainly something that I think is important for power generators to consider in terms of that crosswalk, so that they can take advantage of today what are opportunities to improve their resiliency, while at the same time knowing that they're going to be able to meet future NERC requirements.
excellent. So let's move on to question 5. And this directly relates to regulatory as the next step in the path, which is cybersecurity itself. With the increasing digitalization of assets and the exponential rise of cyber attacks worldwide and across all sectors, not just power and generation industry, everyone is facing heightened cyber risk. The Colonial Pipeline you mentioned earlier, Mike, that attack showed just how fragile parts of our critical infrastructure are. However, finding solutions to these risks is not an easy one. For one, IT and OT, both of which are critical in creating a secure environment, each has different priorities. IT systems are usually renewed after 4 or 5 years, OT systems after 10, 15, sometimes 20 years. IT may wish to introduce new measures to improve security, which IT sees as an imposition that could disrupt operations. Secondly, successful and resilient cybersecurity programs require investment in technology, acquiring new skills and resources, evolving business processes to address new risks. Cybersecurity requires a defense in-depth approach that relies on disparate security controls to span the spectrum of industrial cybersecurity risks. So let me ask, what elements of a security program are the most essential for minimizing outages related to a cyber attack? And why don't we start with you?
Ben, you're muted.
Thank you. So, this starts with the resiliency side, right? We have to consider security when deploying infrastructure. I like the term, right, cyber first infrastructure. So, right, we start with the very planning side of it, and we make sure that we are starting on those places to make sure that we have resiliency to be able to sustain and repair from those types of attacks. And then, from that side of it, there's a number of other aspects, right? Security is around people, processes, and then lastly, technology. So if we're not educating our people, then we are not doing a good enough job in being that first layer of attack, right? Secondly, the process side of things, right? How do we harden these systems, put the right controls in place? How do we measure those controls? Those are all things that need to be done as part of a comprehensive security program. Those pieces, when we talk about implementing and monitoring, those are things like vulnerability scanning, logging those and planning and remediation, deployment of a managed detection and response for both IT and OT technology. There are different types of platforms there that require different types of technology. So you have to account for both of those. And then that planning side of things, right? The disaster recovery plans, and how do you ensure that you can make sure you can get your systems back that are critical, especially ones that encompass edge control systems like emissions or monitoring or tuning in historical data, right? Those are things that are key aspects to operational of the business side of it and required for the operations of the facilities, but they are often on the perimeter of the OT network. And so you want to make sure that those things are being tested and validated, that you have those abilities to be able to recover those things that were possible. So it's a really kind of starting at the very base level, making sure that you are planning it well, you're deploying your infrastructure, then you have ways to test and measure those controls and monitor those, and then validation of those plans.
Yeah, that's a good point. Your plant could be running at 100% availability, but if your emissions monitoring system's not up and running, you can actually be stopped from running your plant. So, all of those edge devices and having insight into what are the connectivities between that, what are the data flows, the unique communication protocols. So some of these devices, your edge, your firewalls and things like that may not have any visibility into it. So it may take a special monitoring device to really to analyze that traffic and flag it and follow and allow you to follow up. We actually had recently where a vendor opened up TeamViewer, and we had a device that was monitoring this traffic, and the plant manager was like, no, that's not an approved method to enter this network. You will not know that unless you have insight into that type of traffic. So if that's one of the things that I would recommend for your security program, you need insight in order to react.
Visibility into the network. Good point.
The procedure in that instance wasn't enough, right? You needed the actual process.
Yep.
Was monitoring and that surfaced that risk, and gave that manager the insight to stop it.
Exactly. Yep.
One of the things that I think is also important is to get that holistic view of the plant, whether it's OT, whether it's IT. Monitoring the entire environment really is what's necessary to ensure that you're protecting all the data flows. And certainly, as you mentioned, there are many ways into even today, control, the control side of the network. So I think a holistic approach to monitoring detection is really critical, so that we get the full picture.
Mike, a follow-up question there. We often tell our clients that security isn't a technology problem, it's a risk problem. How do we get that message, up the chain, up to the C-level?
Well, oftentimes it only gets there when there's some sort of an event or incident, unfortunately, right? When all of a sudden, the plant's down, or you would have to invest a lot of money because you've been hit by ransomware. That raises it really, really quickly. And so, unfortunately, it's just a fact of life today that the risks are multiplying each successive day, and as a result, management needs to look at, and ownership needs to look at risk mediation as a significant and critical portion or part of how they operate their business, and make the appropriate investment to protect themselves. These are valuable assets that can cost hundreds of millions or more. And so it seems to me, if you look at it on a percentage basis, and I understand certainly that plants operate on fairly thin margins, but the fact is if you look at the value of a plant and compare that investment that you need to protect that plant on a percentage basis, it's really quite small.
Thanks, Mike. Rebecca, let's go to the next question. So we're seeing more remote and unmanned locations, particularly for renewables, that require remote access to support the plant. The question is, how can IT efficiently operate and secure a remote site? Ben, want to start?
Sure. It really starts with the technology stack that is allowing that remote access. Building resiliency into that stack. So that's the hardware, the networking components, the circuits that allow that remote connectivity. is kind of the first place that needs to be done. So once you have that resiliency in there, then you're kind of ensuring that you have multiple methods. If something fails, you can continue operations, which is in these types of renewable side of it, right? You want to be able to operate whenever it's efficient and possible. Secondly, when it comes to securing that remote site, having remote monitoring and that telemetry feed of what is happening within all of these systems 24/7 is really key. You're not going to have any eyes on site that are necessarily there that can see something happening, right? All of a sudden something's moving. You need to have that confidence that all of the pieces of data that is occurring from the security perspective is truly what should be happening. And so having some specialized tools that can look at that operational data, whether it's OT or IoT with the Internet of Things, is key in getting that endpoint security monitored by a staff 24/7, 365 is an important aspect of that.
Yeah, and I would just add that this type of opportunity or project really is kind of exciting for us because IT becomes that critical point of control. If you are only remote, you really need to rely on that diversity that your managed service provider is going to put in there. Is there diversity of circuits and networks paths to be able to get that remote access that you want? Are they applying that segmentation to properly secure different components that you might want remote and maybe not on this? So you might have to look at it in a really holistic manner. And then obviously, anytime that you can automate alerts or issues at the plant, that should definitely be part of any project where you're going to only be 100% remote. So that's very, very important.
If you think about remote operations, just like any business, remote operations, and to your point, Luke, the connectivity that has to happen, it becomes really that part of that critical path. The one thing I would add to that, though, is the central location from which you are controlling that remote location, that unmanned location. So not only do you have to have proper infrastructure to provide the kinds of operational controls that you need, but also too, the infrastructure of that central control site also needs to be both efficient, optimized, and secure. And I think one of the things that you need to consider is the resiliency that has to happen all across the continuum of that spectrum of connectivity. And so, you can't stop at one point and assume everything else is going to be secure. You really have to go end to end and ensure that security goes across all that, because certainly the weakest link is going to prove to be the place of your downfall if you're not thinking about the entire environment.
Yeah, good points.
All right, well, let's wrap it up with wrap up the questions with some final thoughts from each of you. What one piece of advice do you have for power plants to utilize IT to improve reliability and profitability? Mike, let's start with you.
Well, this is a great wrap up to this conversation today, because we've talked about a lot of different elements, and certainly, we could spend a lot more time talking about how things could be, improved or enhanced or optimized. But essentially speaking, data, flexibility, automation, all of these components are really the key elements of a sound IT strategy wherever you go, but more so when you look at it in an industrial setting like a power plant, in terms of the ability and best opportunity to generate profits. We know that plants, as I mentioned earlier, operate typically on fairly thin margins, and so even a fraction of a percent makes a huge difference in terms of the profitability and return on investment. And then when you take all of those things and overlay that with very strong, tight security, but security that is made enables flexibility still, as we discussed earlier, then you really have the recipe for an environment that can have very smooth operations, the kind of desired resilience that will propel you forward, and then certainly that profitability that ownership is looking for.
Ben, Luke, who'd like to go next?
Yeah, I'll check in. So, I think you had a lot of really great points there, Mike. It's hard to follow up on what you just said, but I would add one other piece just from like looking at how to solve some of these resiliency challenges and how to do it most profitable, which is look at cloud and think of cloud a little differently. Cloud has been designed around resiliency. That's the way that it's profitable for organizations to operate like Microsoft and Amazon. If they have downtime, they're not making money. So they are literally designed around reliability, just like the power plant's operating. So they have redundancies built into those things that can reduce the cost of deployment. So where possible, consider cloud. It also brings enterprise capabilities at a fraction of the price to businesses. And the availability to deploy security on a very high level within cloud is there. Those capabilities would cost a fortune to deploy on-premise. So some of these things can be deployed much cheaper within the cloud ecosphere. So keep that in consideration when you're looking there, and of course keep in consideration what you can and can't move from the NERC perspective.
Yeah.
Close us out, Luke.
All right. Well, thank you, Michael. So I would say when you're looking for solutions, that to fit some internal need, look at how you can automate that. Ask your vendors, is there a way to automate this process so that those repetitive tasks, things like emissions monitoring, I can think of, there may be a process that you can automate that so that you're freeing up your employees in different groups to do other really important things for the organization. So, I would think that with the platforms that we have today, a lot of people are see my dog. Things like SharePoint. There's a lot of things out there that have workflows and automations already built in, and it might just need a little bit of work and planning to be able to implement those.
Thanks, Luke. So that's our formal questions. Rebecca, before we close out this session, do we have any questions from attendees?
We do. I've got one question from Jim. Jim asks, OT asset management remains one of a perennial challenge, especially concerning the mitigation of vulnerabilities in equipment that cannot be easily taken offline. What approaches to asset management have we seen deployed that have proven effective in the power gen industry?
Yeah, I'll start with that. So segmentation, right? So some assets are going to be very hard to do, and really you need to put compensating controls in place that can mitigate that risk. So one of the best ways to do that is ensuring that only communication that is truly needed and how it's able to be communicated to is there. So you can segment that asset using some technology, whether it's additional firewalls or additional other security controls in place that can help mitigate that risk. There's ways, for example, there's a number of, in December, Log4j alerts that came out, right? There's technologies that, are able to stop that type of communication inbound prior to that could affect a system that's vulnerable to those. So there's a way to filter that information first. So we can look at technologies like those things to help stop that risk and making sure that you're able to still operate with that technology and continue to plan for that replacement whenever it's the right time for it.
A great answer, Ben. And I would add to that as well, in that there are tools that provide both security management as well as asset management in the same tool. So for example, if you're monitoring a control network for security, one of the things that system needs to do is to get an inventory of all the assets that it needs to manage and monitor. So, a good tool will kind of merge those two functions together so that you'll see things like, the identities of those controls, the manufacturer of those controls, as well as, being able to understand what protocols those controls are speaking or communicating with. And then on top of all that, monitor those communications, at the control level, with the network and in the entire environment, the control environment, to ensure that you're identifying anomalies that are potentially taking place. So a good cybersecurity tool should also be a good asset management tool all at the same time.
I'm going to piggyback on that and answer one last piece of that. That same cybersecurity tool, there's possibility for automating those blocking responses to that segmentation. So
absolutely,
very well known, and you know what's supposed to be happening with that type of device, and it sees something outside of that, and it's a type of device that we can protect. We can stop that communication path in real time through automation. So that's just another one.
Thanks, guys. Rebecca, anything else?
That was the only question that I had.
Terrific. You can wrap it up then.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining. Thank you to all of our panelists. Again, you will receive the recording and slide deck later today, so keep an eye out for that. And yeah, thanks so much for joining. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining.